you create an app, it's important to create views or a UI that is consistent throughout the entire app, so that when you click on one view, it's going to look very much the same or similar to the other views. In our last video, I showed you how to do that with colors, so we created color sets and then color constants or extensions to the color struct. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create font constants. Now, what I'm going to show you today is just with fonts, but it's important to understand that it really could apply to just about any sort of UI element. So if you wanted to create a padding constant or corner radius constant or anything really that's part of your UI, you could do it the same way that I'm going to show you right now. So anyway, I'm in the constants file that we created in the last video, where we created an extension to our color struct, and in this case I'm going to create a new struct and call it constants. All right, so there's my struct. It's just going to consist of static constants. So let's get started with our font constant. So I'm going to call it static. Well, I'll say static let. Static, of course, means that it's a class or struct level constant. Let does in fact mean that it's a constant. And then I'm going to call this button font. All right, so this is the font I'm going to use on all of my buttons, and it is going to in fact be a font. All right, so now the initialization of a font object is a little strange, but we're going to use the initializer that is past a UI font. All right, so we're going to construct a font object based off of a UI font. I couldn't tell you the difference between those two objects. I know the UI fonts were used with storyboards, and fonts are generally used with SwiftUI, but outside of that, I don't know what the difference is. All right, so our UI font is going to have two parameters in its initializers, the first being the name of the font that we want to use, and I'm going to use Helvetica New. So let me try to misspell that correctly. All right, so that's the font I'm going to use, and then the size is going to be, we'll go with 50. I don't know, that might be way too big for a button. Seems like it might be, so I'm going to actually go with 24. All right, so when I'm done with that, I think all of my parentheses and everything line up, so it seems like I should be good, but obviously there's an error. So what is that error? It says value of optional type UI font must be unwrapped to value of type UI font. What does that mean? Okay, so when we try to construct or initialize this UI font object by passing it the name of a font and a size, it actually returns an optional UI font, not a UI font object. The reason it does that is because we could do something very simply like misspell our font, which, well, I don't think I did. I think I actually spelled it correctly, but oh no, I didn't. I added an extra I there. Okay, so like if this was misspelled, as I just kind of showed you, right, Swift would go to construct this UI font object based off of the name that you provided, and it would fail because it wouldn't find a system font named Helvetica New. So it would not be able to construct this UI font object, and in turn we couldn't return or pass that UI font object that wasn't even initialized onto the font initializer, right? So again, this could be a UI font if the initialization is successful, but it could also be nil if it fails. So what's the solution? Well, there's a lot of solutions. The first is a terrible solution, but in theory it would work. We could force unwrap this UI font. Okay, so what's the danger here? Well, if our UI font object is successfully initialized, everything's good, no harm done. However, if the initialization fails, when we force unwrap nil, or we use force unwrapping and we find nil, our program's going to crash, right? We're going to get what is the equivalent of a null pointer exception. So the best solution is to use what is called null coalescing, or nil coalescing, I believe, one of those two, right? Okay, so the idea here is when we follow our initialization expression up with two question marks. The way this is going to work is Swift will attempt to initialize this UI font object. If it's successful, then this expression that we're getting ready to write will evaluate to or return or just simply be the UI font object that we initially wanted to create. However, we're going to provide basically a safety net saying if this initialization fails, then let's just give it a UI font object that we know will work, right? So we are going to create a second UI font object just based simply off of the system font, right? And I'll pass it the same size. I'll say 24. Okay. And again, you can see, like, hopefully the idea is, let's try to create this UI font object. If that works, cool. If, however, that fails, then Swift will initialize this system font, which can't fail, right? It has to be able to create a system font, and we just give it the size. Okay, so how do we use this new font that we just created? Well, I'm going to go back over to my content view, and I'm going to modify my hello world text object by setting the font, and I should just be able to say constants dot button font. I know this isn't actually a button, that's okay, and you can see hopefully that the font changed just slightly.